Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for making the time to be here and join us. This is Shoulder to Shoulders public conversation series. Shoulder to Shoulder, we are a multi-faith coalition at the national level of religious leaders and faith communities who are committed to addressing, countering, and preventing anti-Muslim discrimination here in the United States. And we do our work by connecting, equipping, and mobilizing faith communities on this issue. And we've been hosting these public conversations as much as we can, really once a month, since the pandemic started, as a way to continue the conversation in the public sphere around this issue, and be able to highlight different leaders and voices in the field who are doing great work on this issue. And we're really excited to have Dr. Amaarah DeCuir with us today. So my name is Nina Fernando, and I serve as the Executive Director of Shoulder to Shoulder. And I want to give a special shout out to Cassandra Lawrence from our team, who, in addition to serving as Communications and Community Engagement Manager, is the tech whiz on our team, holding down the Shoulder to Shoulder virtual realm. And also Uzma Saber, who serves as our incredible development and outreach specialist. So the topic of today's public conversation is responding to racialized religious discrimination in our schools. Earlier this year, Shoulder to Shoulder, Interfaith Youth Corps, now Interfaith America, and Seeds of Peace partnered on a youth and young adult virtual summit on addressing religious discrimination in our classrooms and communities. And in addition to partnering with amazing facilitators and organizations to host a series of workshops, including a bystander intervention training, a workshop on how to use photographs to build relationships and instigate change, among others, we heard remarks from a comedian and attorney who recently made her TV debut, Yasmin Al-Hadi, and an educator, researcher, inclusive pedagogy fellow, Dr. Amaarah DeCuir, who you're about to hear from today. And we gave Dr. DeCuir an impossible task at this youth summit to present on this topic, responding to racialized religious discrimination in our schools, in just 7 minutes. And so that's why we wanted to follow up and feature a conversation with her again, to give her more time to unpack and explore this topic with us. So Dr. DeCuir teaches education studies and social justice, education leadership, and teaches an anti-racist research methods course she co-designed. She brings over 20 years of teaching and leadership experience from public and private K-12 schools to inform her current work in higher education. So our schools are reflections of greater society, and they should be spaces for learning and growth where every person is valued and treated with dignity. Bullying, which has already been top concerns for parents, students, educators before the pandemic, has increased to new highs in the last year. Black, brown, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, and too many others are targeted for the color of their skin, what they wear, and their religious or perceived religious identity. Dr. Amaarah DeCuir will walk us through how racism and religious intolerance connects to insensitive comments, harassment, school policies, bullying, and deadly violence. She'll share how communities across the country are leading the work to include diverse religious holidays in the school calendar and address racism and religious intolerance before it becomes harassment and violence. She'll share what we can do as students, educators, leaders, parents, and community members to create safe and thriving learning communities for every person across all racial and social identities, no matter how they pray or don't pray or their cultural backgrounds. So without further ado, I want to pass it to Dr. Amaarah DeCuir, and once again share to everyone that's joining that this is a recorded conversation. It's also being live streamed on Facebook, and to create a norm of respect and a space where we listen and we share. There will be a zero tolerance policy for harassment of any kind. We do encourage you to use the chat function if you have any questions or comments you want to make along the way, and we will do our best to incorporate them throughout the program. So thank you all again for joining, and without further ado, Dr. Amaarah DeCuir.
Thank you, Nina. That was a really generous introduction, and glad we have a shared agreement that speaking on this topic does take a tad bit more than 7 minutes. And anytime you put me as an educator in front of a room where I'm able to speak about research and also be in a position to extend conversations, I'm always one that's consistently asking for more time and attention with this work. I have a brief slideshow that I'm going to keep to help me organize my remarks and allow me to keep track of my contributions to this public conversations. But I do want to honor that this is a public conversation that Shoulder to Shoulder is hosting. And as such, I do want to be in conversation with those who have gathered here in this Zoom space and those who might be seeing this conversation recorded or live streamed at another time. So I do invite you to use the chat, and Nina Cassandra will help me to pause and entertain questions or comments that come through from those who are in this conversation with me. The title of my remarks this morning are Race, Racialization, and Religious Discrimination. And Nina asked me to begin by just describing a little bit about who I am and what inspires or motivates me to do this work. So I have to begin by naming I'm an educator, and my work as an educator began over 25 years ago in DC public schools. At that time, I was a young Muslim teacher in a predominantly Black school community. I taught there for a few years and then moved to Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a suburb in the Northern Virginia community right outside of DC. And in that space, I taught many students who identified as Muslim, Jewish, and other faith marginalized students. I then moved into private school leadership. I was a principal of a Muslim school, which is a private school that sought to create a sense of belonging and academic success for Muslim students, Muslim teachers, and Muslim families. And in that work, I collaborated with colleagues who were leaders in Jewish and Christian schools, where I learned that many of our shared priorities and commitments to establishing teaching and learning spaces where students, educators, and families could both learn and practice their faith commitments. Now I'm a faculty member at American University. And in this work, I'm leading a few key research studies on both Muslim student experiences in public schools and a concept that is named faith erasure, which impacts students and educators across many different faith identities as they do their work of teaching or learning in public school spaces. So as an education scholar, I'm committed to advancing equity and justice within schools for all learners, particularly including students of faith. So my presentation this morning seeks to describe how students of faith experience inequities and injustices within schools, and this becomes a reflection of what we see experienced more broadly in larger society. So this word cloud I found helps introduce many of the terms that I think are going to be necessary for our conversation this morning. And I'd like to start with race and then move into the term racialization. Race is a social construct. What this means is that race is not an objective biological fact of our current or historical past. Race is something that humans have socially constructed as an idea, a practice, a way of relating with one another. And as the slide indicates, race has been built over time. For those of you who enjoy looking at history, whether it's American history or global history, you will see that race and racial identities have shifted over time. They are not stagnant. They continue to evolve and change for many different reasons, some political, some social. There are many different reasons that we can see as race as an entity has changed over time. But what we know for sure is that it has concrete, real, demonstrated impacts on people's lives. And it has many interconnecting sides or facets. Today we call this intersectionality. But what this slide helps to demonstrate is that race is something that we humans have created. It changes over time, and those changes impact real people. It's deeply related to the term called racialization. And as the slide indicates, the process of racialization is one way that our society sorts communities and peoples in order to allocate resources and allocate access to resources. We live in a society that is deeply racialized. We use racialization to create hierarchies in our society. We use racialization to sort and organize our relationships to people. So racialization is an output of this human construct of race. Now, racism is another term that we need to agree to include in our conversation this morning. And racism exists on many different levels. And I think this slide gives a very clear description of the complexity of racism. You know, we often talk about racism as that level that's right there in the middle of the screen, interpersonal. We talk about a person being biased or discriminatory against another person or group of people. But we often fail to include in a conversation of racism how it exists internally. Because of all the social messages of race and racial discrimination around us, many people internalize racism within their hearts, minds, and souls and bodies. It impacts people in very deep, impressionable ways. Interpersonal racism, the level above that, is the one that tends to be more familiar to people because it does include the bigotry and the biases that exist between people, both their words, their actions, their beliefs, their practices. The level above that, institutional, shows us that racism can exist within institutions through policies and practices. And the institution we're going to be speaking about today are schools. And in our schools, we have policies and practices that serve to reproduce racism. But then we also need to recognize that racism exists in our larger society. It is systemic. It moves beyond humans interacting with one another. It moves beyond policies and practices embedded in our institutions. It is deeply rooted in our social systems across our society. And it is what allows racial inequities to remain maintained in our larger society. This slide also can be used to demonstrate how racism can exist for people with faith marginalized identities. This is the term that we are using called the racialization of religious discrimination. The racialization of religious discrimination. I do want to name a term that I'm not going to be speaking about today, because when we often talk about racism that exists for Muslims, there's a term that has been very popular in modern times, existing for many generations, but is slowly becoming left out of the public discourse. And it's the term called Islamophobia. Islamophobia. I want to name why I'm not going to be addressing Islamophobia in this conversation today. Because Islamophobia is a form of discrimination that is interpersonal. It's typically rooted as a fear of, thus that root word phobia, a fear of the other or fear of the unknown. In this case, when Islamophobia is described as an experience bearing down upon Muslims, it's described as this fear that people have between not knowing who Muslims are, seeing Muslims as an other, as a different entity. It only limits us to a conversation of racism that is interpersonal. And as we see on this slide, Racism exists in many different complex structures within our society, beyond simply an interpersonal fear that's expressed through bigotry or bias, as Islamophobia discusses. The other concern with framing this as simply Islamophobia and interpersonal bias or bigotry, the solution for Islamophobia is to educate people on Muslims and Islam. Because the understanding is that if one fears the unknown, if one fears the other, the way you counteract that is you give them education on who are Muslims and who is Islam. And that's seen as the antidote to Islamophobia. But what we know is that because racism exists in systemic and institutional levels beyond interpersonal levels, we need to do more than just educate people on Islam and Muslims in order to disrupt the biases and oppression that Muslims are experiencing. We need to address all the forms of racism. We need to teach people about structures of violence, teach people about inequality and war, and how that is deeply impacting oppression directed towards Muslims. When we look at all the complexities of racism, more than just interpersonal bias and bigotry, it allows us to talk about history. It allows us to talk about securitization. We know that this national effort to advance security has been grossly entangled with Muslim oppression. It allows us to address empire building, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and theology that all have direct impact on the lived experiences of Muslims, both in this country and globally. We could use the same logic for our brothers and sisters who are Jewish. The term anti-Semitism should not be reduced to a concept of fear of the unknown or fear of the other. We should not be satisfied with solutions towards anti-Semitism that prioritize increasing knowledge and education on Jews and Judaism. That is not what is going to solve anti-Semitism. Instead, anti-Semitism needs to be understood through the complex relationships of history, genocide, systems of oppression, empire building, false conspiracy theories, and also theology. We need to look at anti-Muslim racism and anti-Jewish racism as systemic, institutional, and interpersonal and internalized. So when we talk about the racialization of faith minoritized communities, it is often described as conflating skin color, birthplace, and perceived religious symbols as attributes of this static, unchanging religious cultural identity. That's how it gets paired with the similarities of racism. Racism serves to create this essentializing of people. It takes people down to this one aspect of their identity, their one religious identity, and presents people of that religious group as homogeneous, undifferentiated, and static. This one group of people where they're all the same. Instead, we know that people exist in intersectional experiences with complexity of many different intersecting identities. And many of those identities are impacted by systemic racism, institutional racism, interpersonal and internalized racism. So again, by naming these experiences as racism, it moves us beyond earlier conceptualizations of simply interpersonal bias and fear to understanding systemic reproduction through structures of violence, inequality, and war against those who are culturally perceived as Muslim, Jewish, or other marginalized religious communities. And we see this, one example is in the spike of hate crime statistics that the FBI has been collecting. where in the year, about 10 years ago, there were 1,480 anti-religious hate crime incidents in the United States, and those worst atrocities of hate continue to spike up through today. So let's talk about why this happens. Why does religious discrimination happen? Why is religion a racialized experience in our country? One, religious ideologies. Too often, our religious ideologies identify an exclusive truth that people of our religious background hold access to the only truth of the world, and therefore all others who don't hold on to our same shared religious ideology must be discriminated against because they represent minority faith groups whose values are different and therefore not the truth. Another way that religious discrimination happens in our society is by anti-religious secular ideologies. When secular ideologies gain such dominant prominence that people of all faith groups, particularly minoritized faith groups, are seen as different or objectionable, that becomes another foster for religious discrimination. Perceived security threats. When the minority group is considered dangerous, discrimination against them is understood as a rational means to neutralize that security threat. It also happens because there's been a history of conflict between religious groups, where the level of repression against that religious group continues to grow and develop through time. We also see in religious traditions themselves that some of them are intolerant and increase conflict directed against minority religious groups. In some instances, there are imagined priorities of democracy and government stability that cause nations and nation states to discriminate against faith minority communities for, as again, an imagined goal of advancing democracy and government stability by racially targeting religious groups. And then lastly, there continues to be political threats where rulers try and assume greater political authority by threatening hate and violence directed against religious minority groups. There are many other reasons why religious discrimination happens. Of course, we can name, again, it could be bias and bigotry from individuals to another. But on this slide, I'd like to continue to assert that religious discrimination functions systemically and institutionally as racism functions in our society, beyond simply an articulation of bias and discrimination between individuals. So there are consequences of this racialized religious discrimination. And we see these consequences in many different aspects of our life. It impacts people interpersonally. Let's speak about Muslims first. Muslim Americans have become increasingly racialized because of their external markers of dress, skin color, sometimes their accent, and the way that they speak their language as a practice in order to pass judgment on religious discrimination and bias, seen as a threat to American culture and national security. And we see this after September 11th, the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that tracks employment law discrimination reported an increase of 250% of claims that were drawn by Muslims for employment discrimination. If we look to our Jewish brothers and sisters, the Anti-Defamation League has continued to track anti-Jewish hate crimes. Over 1,500 such incidents were reported almost 20 years ago, including verbal and physical assaults, harassment, vandalism, property damage, and other acts of hate. These all impact people who are subject to religious discrimination. Socioculturally, people who identify with marginalized faith groups are often left with a social ramification that their faith practices are seen as theologically, morally, and socially illegitimate. This comes from the dominant religious ideologies, marginalizing and silencing more minority faith practices and faith groups. We also see consequences of racialized religious discrimination in public policy. Think about just a few years ago in the 2016 presidential campaign, when 51% of Americans felt that there should be a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. This was a policy impact that came from a racialized religious discrimination targeting Muslims. There are property impacts of racialized religious discrimination. Mosques across the United States continue to be vandalized, including when they are under construction in local communities. Synagogues continue to be vandalized. There is an example of a Holocaust museum in Indiana where swastikas were spray painted, epithets were spray painted on walls, and the museum itself was a victim of arson. Racialized religious discrimination also shows up as violence. We only have to think back to a few years ago at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where white nationalists chanted, "Jews will not replace us," where that rally ended with the death of a counter-protester. Or we look to the loss of life, 11 Jewish brothers and sisters at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, some years ago. Racialized religious discrimination is fueled by hate and is experienced as violence. The number of people in the Sikh community in both Canada and the United States documented a 200% increase in hate crimes after September 11th. The Council on American Islamic Relations documents an increased number of civil rights violations and hate crimes targeting Muslims. And the Anti-Defamation League continues to document religious discrimination targeting Jews. Students experience racialized religious discrimination in our schools and in our communities. It shows up as internalized racism. Remind yourself that was the lower level in that 4-level slide earlier on racism. This happens when young people are subjected to absorbing social messages in our larger society about racism, where in this case, Muslim students have been internalizing this anti-Muslim rhetoric, and it has led to increased stress and anxiety that they exist as their existence as Muslims continues to be threatened in larger society and in schools. Students also experience racialized religious discrimination as bias and discrimination targeting them. There's a study of Sikh youth after 9/11 that found that many adolescents reported various forms of discrimination and immense hardship in their schools. It also results in the form of bullying, particularly religious bullying. It often is stemmed after media coverage of a current event, whether it's an act of terrorism that took place around the world or the death of a terrorist leader. Religious bullying spikes in those moments. It also spikes at the time of religious holidays, particularly around Christmas, when it's clearly noted who is and is not celebrating the Christmas holiday. Religious bullying spikes during school curriculum, particularly in world history classes, when other religious groups are described. and when religious symbols or apparel are recognized on the bodies of young people. In the year 2020, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding found that Muslims between the ages of 19 and 19 to 29 are most likely to experience religious discrimination. And half of Muslim families with a school-age child said that their Muslim student was bullied in the past year because of their religion. 1 out of 4 of those bullying incidents was carried on by an educator. Racialized religious discrimination also shows up as violent hate in our school communities. The Anti-Defamation League reported a 67% rise in anti-Semitic incidents and attacks, including harassment, vandalism, and physical assault. It also shows up as hegemony, where the standard dominant viewpoint becomes suffocating in our society. And we have to see that in many of our schools, a white Christian experience has been elevated to the level of status quo and normal, such that other faith expressions are marginalized, silenced, and othered in our school community. And as students continue to report, many times educators are left with inactions. They simply do nothing in response to incidents of racialized religious discrimination experienced by students. Sometimes they themselves are the perpetrators. There are times when educators act, but in those instances, it is often individual responses to individual situations on a case-by-case basis, directly relevant to whether the educator sees him or herself as an actor in that situation. So let's talk about why we have this racialized religious discrimination in our society. This pyramid of hate is on the screen right now, and I'd like you to take a moment just to notice it. Notice how how it is shaped and organized. And I want to draw your attention to the level blue at the bottom, the level that is called biased attitudes. And I'd like you to think for a moment, if you've got a piece of paper and a pen next to you, I'd encourage you even to write down what your thoughts are. I'd like to task you with thinking of 3 examples of biased attitudes that you might be familiar with that exist in our society, directly related to people with religious marginalized faith identities. Can you think of an example where a person was stereotyped, or where an insensitive remark was said, or when non-inclusive language was used, or microaggression was experienced? It should be pretty quick to be able to identify 3 examples of biased attitudes. And then I'd like you to think with me, what is the consequence for embodying a biased attitude in the example that you just wrote down? Is the consequence external? Usually not. And if I invite you to look at the level that is green, right above the blue, it says acts of bias. Those examples are bullying, ridicule, name calling, slurs, or epithets. Let's do the same thing. Can you think of 3 examples of acts of bias that target religious minorities? And then the question would be the same as well. What's the consequence for practicing an act of bias? Again, many times there's no external consequence. Maybe if you're next to somebody who is going to object, they might tell you, shame you. But beyond that, there's very few social, political, community, family, individual, external consequences. When you move above that to the level of hate that is yellow, discrimination, it may be a bit harder for you to think of examples, but I can tell you that this exists for people of religious minorities. Whether they are politically discriminated against, whether they face educational discrimination, housing discrimination, employment discrimination, this type of discrimination exists. What are the consequences of it? Well, here you could say, well, there's laws against that. And yes, there are, but those laws happen when somebody files a complaint. And in a society that we exist in now, where many people of religious minority backgrounds often recognize that their existence is seen as a threat, they often consume themselves with self-silencing. So discrimination often is allowed to exist without immediate legal consequences. And as we move up through this pyramid of hate and we find ourselves at the level of bias-motivated violence and genocide, that there is when we start to see external consequences begin to be enacted. But even then, when they are called out as being motivated by religious oppression, religious discrimination, it's harder to name. It's harder to call out. And by looking at this pyramid of hate, we can see how the presence of biased attitudes in our society creates space for people to enact acts of violence, creates opportunities for patterns of discrimination to exist, for us to be in a state where we are today in July in the year 2022, where bias-motivated violence and genocide occurs. But what can we do? We need to do something. All right. And this session, this public conversation today is not meant to silence us to a state of inaction, but rather to create calls of action. One, we must prepare to act. The best way to disrupt racialized violence, religious violence, is to make a commitment that we are going to prepare ourselves to act if and when we are to bear witness to any of these practices that we've been describing today. By simply telling ourselves that you are going to be the one who's going to speak up goes a long way shifting your attitude from inaction to action. So you say to yourself, I am a person who will speak up. I will not let hate have the last word. Second thing that we can do is to develop ready responses. We should know in the world that we live in now, we are likely to see and bear witness and hear acts of religious discrimination and bias. So let's get our responses ready now so that we know how to act. You can say, that offends me. You can say, I don't find that funny. You could say, I'm surprised to hear you say that. If you can come up with a response that is ready to go, you will be prepared to use it on demand. You might even begin by having a ready response that's a question, like, what do you mean by that? Or why would you say something like that? Or what point are you trying to make by that? Those type of questions can disrupt bias and bigotry in its moment. A third way that you can act is by echoing support. Maybe you're not the first person to respond. Maybe you're in a group and somebody else responds first by trying to disrupt the bias or the discrimination. Echo your support. Don't just stand there silently saying, thank God they spoke up first. Echo your support and say, I agree with so-and-so. I also find that offensive. Or I also am very confused as to why you said that. Second, determine some of the nuances of your response. Pay attention to your tone. Your tone can communicate many of your emotional responses. Understand the dynamics of change, whether this is about stopping bias in the moment or educating to transform. Speak from your own authority. Speak to authority. These details are deeply important to disrupting racialized experiences in our society. Next, commit to respond. Don't be an educator who leads into inaction. Respond quickly. Anytime somebody brings you a concern that they have experienced religious discrimination or bias, commit to respond. Somehow make a commitment that you will respond and act. And speak up and educate. This is not easy. Talking about race, ethnicity, diversity, religion is not just controversial in our society today, it's challenging. So when you think about how you can get started speaking up and educating, my advice to you is to start at your kitchen table. Start with the people who gather with you every day to eat their meals. Start with your family, your roommates, your close friends, and then consider how to move outward by allying yourself with others who are doing work in your community. But when you start closest to your kitchen table, closest to your neighborhood, that's where you have the most influence and potentially long-term impact. So what I'd like to ask you to do, I'm going to ask Nina and Cassandra to help put you into breakout groups. And when you go into the breakout group, I want you to embody the person that you are that came into this public conversation today. If you're a student and you came into this space because you're a student, I want you to be a student in the breakout room. If you're a classroom teacher and you came into this space to better understand how you can impact your classroom, be a classroom teacher in the breakout room. If you're a school leader, I want you to be a school leader. If you are a community member, if you are a parent, I want you to be that role in your breakout room. And hopefully by the magic of Zoom and random assortment, we should get people with different roles into the breakout rooms. Let's hope for that. And if not, then lean into the fact that this will be a room full of community members or a room full of parents. And even then there can be nuance and difference in how you respond in the breakout room space. So leading into the role that you came into today, I'm going to show on the slide 4 different scenarios. And I want to tell you before you read these scenarios to take care of your heart and your soul. Because what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you real scenarios of real people who are impacted by racialized religious discrimination. So seeing these scenarios is hurtful. It's difficult to have to see what people experience in our society. So please take care of yourself as you begin and prepare yourself to read these 4 scenarios that will be on the screen. And then as you're reading the scenarios, Nina and Cassandra are going to put you into a breakout room. And the first thing I'd like you to do in the breakout room is to simply tell people your first name and your role, right? So Amaarah, an educator, that's it. Please don't tell us where you're from. Please don't tell us why you're in the public conversation. Our time is so short. All right, so first name and your role. Just go around the breakout room and say that. That should take about 20 seconds. The second thing that you need to do in your breakout room is you need to make a group decision. I'm going to give you 4 scenarios on the next screen. Your group decide to talk about one scenario first. You don't have to start at number 1 and work your way down to number 4. Start at any of them first, and then when you finish that conversation, you're welcome to move to a second scenario next. I doubt you will get through discussing all 4 scenarios. And when you're having this conversation, I want you just to answer the question, what will you do? What will you do to respond to that situation if that situation were in front of you and you were the principal? What would you do to respond to that situation if it was in front of you and you were another student? So here are the scenarios. And as Nina and Cassandra organize the breakout rooms, what I do encourage you to do, and please forgive me because this is a limitation with Zoom, you may want to hold up your phone if it's next to you and take a picture of this slide, because when you go into a breakout room, you can't see my slide deck any longer. And then I'm going to be quiet so that you can read these scenarios. And then in a moment, I will begin to see people moving into breakout rooms.
Okay, everyone. I just wanted to quickly conclude the recorded part of our program and thank Dr. Amaarah DeCuir again for this really illuminating presentation, and turn folks who are watching the recording, who are joining live, who are not able to be in the breakout room conversations, to that final slide on what will you do, what can you do, and remind folks that you don't have to be an expert on these issues in order to respond, in order to take action. There is a role to play. And thank you again for joining us. Please know Shoulder to Shoulder is here as a resource, and happy to connect you to folks like Dr. DeCuir if you're looking for any specific resource or follow-up information. And thank you again for joining us. So I will conclude the recorded part of our conversation today, and thank you all again.